to Mind Escape. Are you ready?
Are you ready to escape your mind?
All right, folks, welcome back to Mind Escape. I am your host, Mike. We have episode number 323 tonight. If you were wondering, has it been a while? Yes, it has been. It's been about 3 months here since I've taken a little bit of a hiatus break from social media. I just needed to reset and recalibrate. We've been doing the show for over 7 years now at this point, so I just wanted to address that really quickly. Maybe the next episode I'll do a solo episode. We'll talk about everything that's happened since, because some major things have happened. But tonight we have a special episode. I am joined by author and historian Gregory Shushan, who's a Ph.D., and he's written a decent amount of books. I think the one that I've read recently that everybody should go check out is Near-Death Experiences in Ancient Civilization. That link is down below, and you can check out Gregory's website as well. And I have the Inner Traditions page. Shout out to Inner Traditions for setting this up. Thank you so much. And there's also the Amazon link there too if you buy your books on Amazon. So check those out. Gregory is as I mentioned, a near-death experience researcher for ancient civilizations. He is a historian of religions, award-winning author, leading authority on near-death experiences in the afterlife across cultures throughout history. Dr. Gregory is a visiting research fellow at the University of Winchester's Center of Death, Religion, and Culture. And he's also a fellow of Parapsychology of the Parapsychology Foundation. He holds a degree in religious studies at the University of Wales Lampeter. His research methods for the Humanities, and let's see what else here. Oh, he's also an Egyptian archaeologist with a degree from the University College of London. And let's see here. Yeah, quite the resume. How are you doing, Gregory? Welcome on.
I'm good, Mike. Thanks.
I tried to get it all in there. There's so much. You do have a ton of qualifications and certifications and degrees, so I just wanted to make
around a lot, so.
Yeah, I just wanted to get that out of the way. But so yeah, welcome on the show. This is something, as I mentioned to you off air, we've talked a lot about on the show, near-death experiences. I've actually had my own near-death experience, 2 of them within the last year and a half. I was already fascinated with the topic. We had already been discussing it a lot on the podcast, and then I kind of had my own. It's kind of added more questions than I even had before. You would think if going through something like that, you would have more answers, but actually just added more questions to my repertoire. But why don't we start about your origin story with this? How did you get into it? What made you write this book? And let's start from there.
Sure. Yeah, and any perspective you have as an experiencer on all this stuff, I'd be happy to hear that too. So yeah, I started out in Egyptian archaeology at University College London, and actually before that I had done some Eastern Mediterranean archaeology as well. So I was pretty focused on things that didn't have anything to do with parapsychology or near-death experience or anything like that. I wasn't, I still don't consider myself a parapsychologist. Really, I'm really a historian of religions, looking at certain kinds of, parapsychological phenomena in relation to the ancient world, in relation to different religions around the world. So, but I knew about near-death experiences, and I'd, read about them. I read Raymond Moody's book. I'd seen flatliners or whatever, and I always thought it was a really interesting phenomenon. I didn't really have a take on it one way or another, whether I believed in them or not. It's just kind of one of these things that's like, wow, people have these experiences and come back to life and talk about it. I wonder if there's something to it. And then I moved on to other stuff. So, so I'm doing my Egyptian archaeology degree, and we're reading the ancient texts, and some of these ancient texts, well, a lot of them have to do with the afterlife. So there's the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, Book of the Dead, and so on. And they're all pretty similar. They do evolve over time in some ways, but for the most part, it's 3,000 something years of consistent beliefs in this stuff. So as I'm reading them, I'm starting to think, this actually, if you strip away all of the specific cultural elements and just look at them as almost like symbolically, then it started seeming like a near-death experience to me. So, for example, the spirit leaves the body, travels through darkness, comes out into a place of light where there's a being of light, which is in Egypt was the sun god. They then have an encounter with their own corpse, which is symbolized by the deceased being associated with the god Osiris. So the texts basically say, you get to the center of this area of the underworld and you encounter your own decaying corpse in the form of the god. And that experience is what enables the soul to continue to the next stage in the afterlife. And to me, that was symbolic of, in near-death experiences, people will see their body lying there, and it's that realization that, I'm dead, and yet here I am having sensations and perceptions and consciousness, makes them realize that they're dead, that they've transcended their physical death, and then they're able to continue into the next phase of the experience. So exactly like the meaning behind the Egyptian expression of this idea. They meet their deceased relatives. There's like a life review type thing where their actions on Earth are kind of evaluated. There's no return to the body except for visiting it, because the soul has to visit the body in Egyptian belief to kind of keep it maintained. But it's not a near-death experience per se, but it's just the concept of the afterlife was so similar. So I just started thinking why that would be the case. And given the fact that near-death experiences happen all over the world, it seemed like the near-death experience would be the basis for the belief, rather than, Egyptian afterlife beliefs influencing near-death experiences around the world, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. And I was pleasantly surprised when I got into your book, not just because of your impressive background, but because of you approached it from a comparative analysis standpoint, which I really appreciate, because I feel like there's not enough bird's eye view on these topics, and that's why you get some of the more woo takes on things, and then or the super strict takes that are don't allow for any kind of movement there. So I really appreciated that. How did you approach studying the ancient texts and the archaeological evidence to identify the different parallels with the modern NDE or near-death experience?
Yeah. So the civilizations I compared were Egypt, Sumer in Mesopotamia, and the Old Babylonian period of Mesopotamia, China before Buddhism, India before Hinduism specifically. They kind of have some of the same gods kind of developed as Hinduism developed. And then also from Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztec civilizations. So the reason I chose those was because they were mostly developed independently of each other. So there couldn't be any argument that like, oh, well, the Egyptians influenced the afterlife beliefs of the ancient Chinese, and that's why they're similar. So I wanted to kind of nip that argument in the bud, because nobody can really argue that. There's no evidence for anything like that to happen. And the farther away the civilizations get in time as well as geographically, then the less likely it is. So despite what people might see on Ancient Aliens or whatever, there's no influence from Egypt to the Mayan or Aztec civilizations or anything else. So
yeah, you'll see stuff sometimes like the cocaine mummy stuff. You'll see actually the Vedic stuff I found very interesting. We did a deep dive on what was Soma, the ancient elixir, and I went through all the comparisons from the Rig Veda and the Avesta and all the translations that obviously these people were having this experience from this elixir. What was this elixir? I can't, there's different books on it. Chris Bennett's a cannabis historian. He believes it was cannabis. other people. Who else? There's Matthew Clark, who thought that it was maybe some sort of ayahuasca analog or something like that.
Right.
I came to the conclusion that it was some psychoactive compound with ritual. It didn't matter because there's different descriptions, and when you look in the, what are they called, yasnas, the
Hmm.
yasnas, and the different parts of these books, it just seemed like there wasn't super, consistent, at least translations, because I'm not able to read ancient Sanskrit or
Yeah.
Avestan or whatever, so I have to rely on the translations. But it's so when you look at these texts and all these different things, how much room do you leave for interpretation, or do you try? Are you making like leaps to try and connect these things, or is it pretty plain if you were able to show the person, like some random person, a translation?
Yeah. Well, I worked only with the most up to date, most scholarly translations out there. So, for example, there was when I first was working on this project. This goes back 25 years, by the way. I first started it when I was doing my master's at the Institute of Archaeology, and that was the section kind of comparing the Indian and Egyptian afterlife beliefs. Um, at that time, there was no complete translation of the Rig Veda at all, and now there's, I think, 5 or 10 years ago, maybe, a brand new like 3 volume translation, the first complete scholarly one in English ever. So I updated everything with that, and I actually was able to find more accounts of NDEs and more examples of relevant kinds of texts. But really, it's a case of with Egyptian, I was able to check some things to make sure that I was understanding correctly, because I had the hieroglyph Middle Egyptian background. But with the other languages, it's really a case of standing on the shoulders of giants, as they say, and accepting, trusting that all the generations of previous scholars um, have come to basically a more or less correct translation that I can trust what they're saying. So aside from that, I really let the context of the text steer me. So if something was a purely shamanic text, like for example, you mentioned soma. If it's a soma generated vision without an afterlife or death or near death context, I didn't really consider that at all. It had to have that death and afterlife context. So but you're right that to some extent, because these are texts about the afterlife and not, technically descriptions of near-death experiences, like they don't say somebody died and came back to life, then there was a degree of kind of speculation to it, and really kind of looking at like if they're similar in all of these societies around the world, then how can we explain them? And it seemed to me that because we have this experience that's also similar to these same phenomena that we're finding around the world, then that seems like a good place to start in explaining it. And then on top of that, we have a few actual NDE accounts from all of the societies except for Egypt, which is interesting.
Yeah, well, just because you would have to know the mythos behind that particular civilization or religion or whatever, and then from there parse out these different experiences, if you will, from what was already known at the time, right? Or something along those lines.
Yeah, and again, the context is a big thing. A good example is, well, first I should say, with Egypt, the uses to which writing were put in ancient Egypt were extremely limited. So it was these religious priestly texts, which were essentially ritual texts for the afterlife to help the mummy transition to the next world and have a positive afterlife there. Otherwise, it was used for accounting and business and kind of royal um, types of occurrences. It wasn't used for um, personal narratives or stories very much, at least not until the Middle Kingdom. And there's no context for people to write down a near-death experience that they had. So, um, but a good example of the kind of parsing the different types of texts that you mentioned, if we look at ancient Sumer, we've got um, stories like the myth of Inanna, where the goddess Inanna descends to the underworld, and she goes there with the intent of overthrowing the goddess of the underworld and taking her place. It's this kind of power play, so she can become the queen of the underworld. And it's got this whole. First of all, she's a goddess, so it's not happening to a human. and it's got all these kinds of very mythological kinds of features to it. It's involved also with fertility ideas, the circuit of Venus through the sky. It serves to explain different kinds of phenomena in the world. So in contrast to that, we've got an account called The Death of Bilgamesh. Bilgamesh was the Sumerian name for Gilgamesh, who everybody knows from the Epic of Gilgamesh. But this particular text didn't make the final cut, basically. It's a pre-Epic of Gilgamesh story
I
of
like that
basically
better. Was it Bilgamez, did you say?
Bilgamesh, yeah.
Yeah, I like that better.
Yeah. Um, and so this account basically and by the way, he's believed to have been a historical king. So he's the first like real individual, whereas Inanna was a goddess.
Well,
So
because they have that King's List too that goes back super far, where you can't really justify through
yeah,
historical records, right? Like their King's List, similar to what is it, the Egyptian one with the old King's List too. I'm drawing a blank on
yeah,
the
those
text.
a lot of those earlier kings are, probably not. It's probably not
Right.
authentic
Like
lists that
mythological
people look at.
or
Yeah,
maybe exaggerated, or obviously with the
right.
timelines and everything.
Yeah, and they put gods on them and everything to kind of have this origin myth of divine kingship that's extending into the present day to show if my origins lie in Osiris and the sun god or whatever. Um, but in contrast to all that, we've got the epic of or the death of Bilgamesh text, where he's known to have been a historical king. At least that's what archaeologists and Assyriologists think. Um, and this text describes his NDE. He's lying there on his deathbed after being almost mortally wounded. He goes to the other world, traveling through darkness, meets the sun god, who's Utu, so he's a being of light. His relatives and friends are there, other people who had died before him. There's like a life review. They look at the deeds of his life, and then he's transformed by the experience because the judges in the other world decide to make him into an underworld judge. So when he dies, when he comes back, he'll be one of those judges of the dead. And then he goes back to his body and prepares his funeral and everything else. So again, the context there is everything. The context is we have a historical king, and the account doesn't involve like some mythological type of event. It's presented as being factual in contrast to like the story of Inanna or whatever. So to
In
me, that's a huge difference.
in the Mesopotamian cultures, obviously we're talking about
Mhm.
Syria and Sumer and Acadia. Um, the underworld was depicted as dark and like a foreboding place. How do you reconcile this as a positive element, similar to some of the more positive elements that people have of like modern day interpretations of NDEs?
Yeah, that's a great question actually, because this is one of those kind of byproducts of my work that I love encountering, but I don't expect along the way. So the kind of received wisdom in Mesopotamian, Sumerian Assyriology studies is that exactly what you said, that the afterlife was seen as this gloomy, shadowy kind of place, and it was either punishment or you're just kind of like half alive in this shadowy realm, sitting in a corner doing nothing, this hazy kind of non semi-existence. But I actually found lots and lots of references in the Sumerian texts to feasting in the other world, to light, spring rivers, birds, meeting your deceased relatives, happiness, transformation, rewards, and just the fact that there are judges to judge you implies that there's a choice of fates in the other world. So I think this was something that was vastly exaggerated by previous scholars, and I think it lies in the fact that, like in the 19th century, a lot of these scholars came from Old Testament studies. So I think they were viewing um, the Sumerian and Mesopotamian beliefs as like the precursor to Jewish afterlife beliefs, which are more kind of this shadowy half-life kind of thing. So it's almost like they systematically ignored a lot of these other descriptions. And in fact, there's a fairly recent book about the Sumerian afterlife where the author says something like, because we have all these descriptions of positive afterlife beliefs in these texts, that means that they're not orthodox, that we should kind of dismiss them and not really consider them as representative of Sumerian beliefs. Um, the evidence is there. So I don't think there is a conflict between those texts and the more positive features that we see in near-death experiences.
Interesting. As we mentioned, the Epic of Gilgamesh and now the Bilgamesh, which we just learned about, which, again, I like that name. I don't know. It just rings a little bit better around the dome for me. But so we're talking about Mesopotamia. Obviously, their mythos is always some sort of hero or somebody goes on a journey. How does that compare to modern NDEs? Is that something like maybe that person's NDE was like a dream, not a dream, but like how, people come back, they had this fantastic journey in the afterlife and then came back. Are those connected, or is it just building off of this NDE and turning it into something more, or something along those lines?
I think it's exactly that. Yeah. I think it's a case of this idea that people die and come back to life, or that they can, in exceptional circumstances, die and come back to life and tell about the experiences that their consciousness had while they were separated from their body. I think just that one thing, combination of one thing, was enough to influence a lot of these mythological stories about descent to the underworld and returning and things like that. Again, a big difference, like Bilgamesh, he goes outside the body. He's explicitly described as, his soul leaves his body, whereas Inanna and Dumuzi and these other kinds of Mesopotamian characters or gods, they usually go in the body, or it's just not described at all, and it's kind of presumed that they're in the body. The myth of Dumuzi, that has a few really interesting features. He realizes he's dead. He's in the other world, and then he is in the out of body state, but he's able to see what's going on Earth. And he only realizes he's dead when he sees that his mother and his sister are making beer out of his blood, out of the blood of his corpse. And once he realizes that, it's again like that corpse encounter from ancient Egypt. That's like a transformational moment for him, and he's able to move on. But that myth, it's like involved with wine and beer and the cycles of nature and basically the harvest kind of.
Say the blood beer, something similar to almost like Christianity, like drinking the blood of Christ or something
Right.
along those lines.
Yeah.
Have you found any, was there any carryover between Mesopotamia into Egypt, or is Egypt and Mesopotamia, as far as you're concerned, obviously there's tons of differences, but was there any overlap, or are they completely distinct in their beliefs of the afterlife and NDEs and things like that?
Yeah, they seem to be really distinct, actually. I mean, they did have trade and contacts, and from really early periods, but it really seems not to have impacted their religious cultural development all that much. There's a couple of references to Mesopotamian gods in the pyramid texts, or like one god from Byblos, I think, and they were like minor deities. So, how that crept in there, we don't really know. But yeah, it doesn't seem like there's really much that was shared culturally between them or religiously.
So we've talked a lot about ancient Egypt. I mean, a lot of the ancient civilizations in general on the show, but specifically ancient Egypt, I've always been fascinated with Egypt and Greece. I don't know why. I just feel, some sort of interest or connection to those two ancient cultures. Greece for the philosophy and, all that stuff. And then metaphysics, and in ancient Egypt for, the architecture and megalithic building, the possible psychoactive compound use, and now we're talking about near-death experiences. When you look at stuff like the Book of the Dead, let's say, is there specific examples of what is considered to be, you think, an NDE based in that book, or do you have to interpret it? Is it like hard to find in there? I mean, I feel like I've read part of it. I have like a picture book somewhere of it over here somewhere. I can't find it, but yeah, like when you're looking through like the diagrams and the pictures and the translations and everything, have you found specific things that you're like, that's an NDE or that's part of an NDE, or is it up for interpretation?
Yeah, I think it's up for interpretation. But all of the NDE elements are embedded in the text somewhere for sure. It's I worked mostly with the pyramid texts and coffin texts because they were the earliest. And again, I wanted to kind of mitigate this idea that they could have been influenced by another civilization. And so the pyramid texts, for example, are ritual texts, and we're not even sure the order in which they're to be read. They think that certain walls are to be read first as the coffin is wheeled into the pyramid. But piecing together like a sequential narrative of events of what happens in the afterlife is pretty difficult, and to some extent it's speculative, but in a lot of cases it's also pretty clear where it's going. So because obviously the soul leaves the body first, it goes through all these kind of caves and caverns and perils, has to overcome different threats, like a venomous snake that attacks, and apes with swords, and all these kinds of half animal, half human deep demons that kind of try to annihilate the soul on the way to the other world. So obviously you overcome those obstacles on your way to get to the sun god. So it's really just partly a matter of logical conjecture. But then at the same time with Egypt, it's more complicated because they also describe the afterlife as like a circuit. So you join the sun god and you join him on his boat, and that sails through the Milky Way and the cosmos, and then it sails around the earth into the netherworld under the earth, and then sails back again. So in some texts, that's portrayed as like a kind of eternal circuit of joining the sun god. But then in others, it portrays like the marsh of offerings, or particular paradise kind of like area. They portray that as the ultimate goal. So whether that's an internal contradiction, which a lot of earlier Egyptologists thought, or whether it's a more kind of transcendental kind of description of omniscience and omnipresence of the soul, which is kind of what I tend towards, is probably unknowable ultimately. So yeah, there's lots of room for interpretation in all these texts.
While we're on the subject, I don't want to go too deep into this, so I just want your opinion as somebody who's an academic and a scholar. What do you think about what's going on between this battle between online creators, content creators, people with pull and influence, versus kind of the academic establishment in terms of archaeology? Right now it seems like you have this battle between alternative and mainstream, as they're calling it. Do you have a take on it? Because personally, from doing the show, I've met a lot of cool people, scientists, authors, academics, and I've met a lot of cool free thinkers too, So for me, I've met cool people on both sides. I got into this through the alternative stuff and slowly kind of, okay, now I'm going to look into what science has to say or academics has to say. And I'm at the point now where it's like, this window of mystery is a lot smaller. There's still stuff to be found. There's still mysteries. There's still stuff like we're talking about right now, where I've even had my own experience and I don't know what to think about it. But then we have a lot of woo stuff out there too. Like, where do you stand on all that? Do you have an opinion on it? Where do you think it's going?
Yeah, I have a lot of opinions on it. So, I started doing archaeology at University of London in 1996 or whatever, at a college there called Birkbeck, which was like an adult college kind of thing, community college type, the British equivalent. But their lecturers were all from University College London, from Cambridge, from Oxford. And then I went to University College London, Institute of Archaeology, one of the most prominent archaeological institutes in the world. I studied Egyptology there with some of the most, well-known Egyptologists in the world. These were, by and large, some of the most open-minded, intellectually honest, interesting, progressive people that I've ever known in my life. There was never, ever any hint of them like hiding the truth or not being willing to go on wherever the evidence might lead them. So, and I'm actually evidence of that, because I was allowed, I was supported in studying. First, I for my undergraduate thesis, I did a comparison of dreams in ancient Egyptian and Greek archives, and then I did this near-death experience project. So they understood that I'm not you can kind of study anything as long as you do it from a theoretically, methodologically rigorous kind of standpoint. So the problem I have with, I don't call them alternative archaeologists. I think pseudo-archaeologist is a better word. There's only one type of archaeologist. There's not mainstream or alternative. There's pseudo and there's real. So someone like Graham Hancock, I don't have anything against him personally. A lot of these people, obviously I don't even know them. So I don't think any more than I think actual archaeologists are hiding the truth. I don't think these people are have any nefarious
The hiding the
plans.
truth thing is odd to me in the sense that why wouldn't that person want to take credit for it? Like if you found, let's say Plato didn't use Atlantis as almost like the allegory of the cave, but for a civilization. Let's say he didn't do that. Let's say there was a real Atlantis. Somebody found it, like how they found Troy. Wouldn't that person want to take credit for that? Like that's what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
Like it doesn't make that argument doesn't make any sense to me. I never really understood that. I do think that when you get into any sort of field, whatever it is, some people do like to think they're the expert on it regardless. So I think online, from what I've seen, you do have some scholars kind of getting maybe not the best attitude with the general public, and I think that leads to problems. Now, I'm not saying that they're not antagonized or anything like that. I'm just making the point that, like, it's a complex subject. That's why I brought it up to you. And I agree with you. There is, you've spent your life on this. You've gone to school for it and everything. Somebody watching 2 YouTube videos that's pretending to know more about it than you do is kind of laughable, right? So
which happens.
It does happen, and it's cognitive bias, and that's something we talk a lot about on the show, through philosophy and psychology. And let's take it back to epistemology. How do we know what we know? What's the theory of knowledge behind this? If somebody doesn't have an answer, then what are we even talking about? So
and archaeology is an evidence-based field. People don't theorize without evidence. Well, they might have in the old days, and even in the old days when they would come up with these grand diffusion kind of theories, like all civilization came from Egypt or from Druids or whatever it was, these 19th century ideas. Even then, they tried to use physical evidence to try to piece it together. And I think, they were maybe thought they were being innovative and were doing some genuine work, even if they were later proved to be wrong.
I don't even think there's that many people trying to do the physical evidence thing in this, what do you want to call it, pseudo, alternative, whatever it is. What I've noticed is human beings, we love a good pattern, a good mystery, a good conspiracy, whatever it is. We love putting things together and being the person to figure it out. So I think that there's just a lot of people out there that, religion's kind of fallen to the wayside. You have a lot of people that may be a little lost spiritually out there that are looking for something, whatever it is. And I think that it's easy to get caught in this mind trap of, again, cognitive bias, pareidolia, trying to connect dots that aren't there, trying to fit things. And then you have people trying to make content, trying to make money, trying to get a name for themselves, trying to do that whole thing. So I think it's a little bit of everything. But I don't see much substance from this, whatever you want to call it, alternative. And that's how I got into all this stuff. So I just want to keep pointing that out, that 8 years ago or 9 years ago or whatever, I was very romanticized by some of these ideas, and then you start looking into it, you're like, oh, okay, this there's really not much to this. But I still find it interesting. I'll still watch some of the crazier stuff and just see what they're saying. So sometimes there's a little nugget in there, of something cool, but for the most part, a lot of it's just these people making these connections through their mind or making assumptions about things that they don't know about and things like that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is profit motivated. It's people just seeing a way to make money on these books and videos and things. But I think the people who are consuming it and believing it are also, I don't want to generalize, but I think there's an element of paranoia in it. There's such a mistrust of the government and of, COVID vaccines and any kind of knowledge that people have been, fed. They're suspicious of these days. In some cases, rightly so, because the government has lied to people on many occasions, but we're at a point where like nothing is trusted, and so the value of actual experts in fields is no longer recognized
Well,
by a
that's
lot
the
of
other thing. It's again, you spent a lot of your life dedicated to this. Like, imagine for anybody out there that's skeptical of this, imagine putting yourself in your shoes, whether you're a mechanic or an engineer or whatever. You spent your whole life doing this thing. To have somebody come in to watch like a couple videos on something or read a handful of books or whatever the case may be from, different authors or whatever, and to think that you know more than somebody that's dedicated their life to something is kind of crazy, right? Like,
Yeah.
we all play Dunning-Kruger and, oh, I probably could figure that out or whatever. But at the end of the day, I think it comes down to being honest with yourself. How much of something do you know? Just because you want something to be true or it sounds better or more romantic or whatever doesn't necessarily make it true. And
Yeah.
again, to these people that are studying this stuff, like you and others or whatever, going through the scientific rigor and scientific method, to think that somebody would pass up on publicizing a huge find or discovery or something like that doesn't make any sense. And
No.
yeah, I mean, it just that think about how many people actually do archaeology, and all of them come
Yeah.
to similar conclude. Like, that doesn't make any sense. It's
Yeah,
just
and these accusations that they're not excavating here where they should.
and
It's like
again, I don't like
there's
dogma on any
funding, there's
sides. There are
yeah,
dogmatic scientists for sure. There's no
yeah.
doubt about that. But it's
No,
just
it's true, and there's arrogance for
it,
sure.
it comes down to, again, being able to be intelligent enough to look at the epistemology, the ontology, the teleology of these topics, and really parse out what's what, and be honest with yourself, be honest with your own bias, be honest with, there's shows where I'm like, for what is it, Cave of Bones with Lee Berger or whatever. I so badly want that pre-hominid being to be able to make those symbols, because that would mean that they understood death and death burial before current modern day humans, which would take the metaphysics of an afterlife way back further, but there's skepticism surrounding that and questions surrounding that, and so
Yeah,
it's things like that. Like, I fall into those same categories too, so I have to catch myself, and but yeah, I just wanted to get your take on it. We can get back to your book stuff. I just thought that we were kind of in that realm of things, so I thought I would ask your opinion
sure.
on it.
Yeah, yeah. I'll just say one more thing, and that's like I think people don't understand. First of all, what the field methods and techniques and analytical methods of archaeology are, like how they reach their conclusions. And they also don't understand academia in general, like how academia works. An archaeologist can't just say, I'm going to go, excavate this particular spot in Egypt. I'm going to go find the secret lost library in the Sphinx or whatever. You can't just do that. It's hugely expensive. You need all kinds of permits. You can. I went on an excavation in Egypt. We were actually in the country, and the Supreme Council of Antiquities canceled it with no explanation, no reason. Just left this excavation hanging. So this kind of stuff can happen all the time, and that's obviously not the fault of archaeologists. But again, also just knowing what archaeology is as a discipline, I think that should be the first thing people learn before they start criticizing archaeologists for what they think that they're doing or not doing.
And I think a good rule of thumb is just, can we all agree that we don't know everything and that we're constantly
Exactly.
learning? Like, I think if we can
Yeah.
all achieve that, there's together that we come together. Oh, this picture's not finished yet. We need to keep chipping away at it, and then the next
Yeah.
generation will chip away at it, and then there'll never be an end. But who
Yep.
knows? But
Yep.
yeah, so I just wanted to again bring that up. I've done episodes on all the stuff we just talked about and everything, and again, it's coming from the complete alternative view on all this stuff, all these topics,
Mhm.
and all the woo. We've had all the people, like we're talking about near-death stuff. I'm trying to think. We had, I don't know if you're familiar with Evan Alexander, who is a
Yeah.
neuroscientist who had his own near-death experience. We've had him on.
Mhm.
I've had who else? Lots of
He wrote
people.
an endorsement for the new book. Actually, I think he's a pretty open-minded,
Yeah.
serious, genuine guy.
Rob
Even though,
Gentile. I don't know if you're familiar with Rob Gentile. He had
no.
two traditional near-death experiences, and he didn't have a heart for a while. Actually, he was waiting for a heart transplant and stuff. And then when he actually got the transplant, the girl that he got the transplant from, he started having all these weird cravings, and he found out, like, through talking with her family later on, like, those were her favorite, like, snacks and things like that, which is kind of weird. Like, do the organs have do our organs carry some sort of consciousness or memory? You know, it's something to think about for sure.
Yeah, I've heard stories like that. So I have
All
no
right.
opinion on
Well,
them.
let's move on back to the book then. I don't want to go too far down. Like I said, that could be a whole different separate episode. Maybe we'll have you back on and just, you know, get into the weeds with that whole topic, because I think that there's so many
Sure.
different things you could talk about too. But okay, I do want to talk about, because I mentioned we talked about Soma. We've done episodes on Soma. What was Soma? The different theories, the translations. When you're looking at Vedic traditions and everything, obviously reincarnation seems pretty central to their way of life and their beliefs and everything. Does the NDE stuff align, challenge, or like how does that work with this idea of near-death experiences in ancient civilizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the earliest Indian texts, like the Rig Veda, there is almost no hint of reincarnation. It's not part of the doctrine of Vedic religion yet. But from the earliest times, we have there's like this stream of accounts that are very much like near-death experiences. There's only a couple of brief ones in the Rig Veda, but then in the Upanishads and some of these later texts, there are very clear indications. There's one about a little boy named Nachiketas who goes to the other world. Well, first his father, he's annoying his father. His father's like giving away all of his worldly possessions. And he says to his father, "Who are you going to give me to?" And his father doesn't answer him, and he keeps pestering. And so the father finally says, "I'll give you to death," meaning basically that he kills him. So this little boy goes to the other world, and he's waiting for Yama, the god of death, but he's nowhere to be seen. He's basically left there alone for 3 days. And then Yama finally appears, and he's all embarrassed at his lapse in hospitality. So he grants 3 wishes to this little boy. And basically it's this whole kind of discourse about the secrets of life and death and the mysteries of life and death at that point. And then the boy eventually will go back to his, come back to life. But I think as reincarnation becomes more of an established doctrine in Indian religion, the fewer of these near-death experience type accounts we have. So I think that's an interesting parallel. It kind of like, as reincarnation becomes the dominant ideology, then the near-death experience is less relevant. So, I mean, we do have some later accounts of like intermission memories where children who remember past lives will remember also the death of their previous life, and that's described very much like a near-death experience. So we've got some of those from contemporary or 1940s onwards India. But as far as the ancient text goes, yeah, there's kind of a gap in NDE accounts for a lot of at least Hindu history. We've got a lot in Buddhism, but from Hinduism there really aren't that many after a certain point.
Yeah, the Soma thing, a lot of it points to communing with the gods, attaining light, immortality. It's less about dying. I mean, and there's some people that'll make the argument too that that book, The Immortality Key, was based on is dying before dying, or experiencing, the psychedelic experience and the Eleusinian mysteries, dying before you actually die, and understanding the importance of this and everything like that. But when you look at that, like as I mentioned, it seemed to be more about life, like what you're saying, like the Rig Veda. I haven't read the whole thing, but just the parts that I read for the Soma stuff seemed to be more about life and living and that kind of thing, as opposed to like what you're saying, like NDE, death. And I mean, obviously Egypt's heavy in death, like all the, from the mastabas to the pyramids to the sarcophagus to everything, the mummies, all that stuff. So they have like a culture of death where it seems like the ancient, whoever they were, Indo-Iranians, Vedic culture, whatever, seem to be very into life and that whole thing. So
Yeah, and I think where we do have near death type experiences in the Rig Veda or whatever, it's the emphasis is less on the death aspect and what we can learn about death and dying and returning. It's more about um, the kind of glories of the other world and this mystical consciousness. There's even a near death experience of a horse in one of them, which I think is really interesting because it's described in similar terms of as a human's near death experience.
interesting.
Yeah.
What was pre-Buddhist ancient China in regards to these thoughts and metaphysics and religious stuff pertaining to the NDEs?
We actually have quite a few NDEs from ancient China going back to like the 8th century something, 800 something BCE. I don't remember the exact date, but they're presented, and in contrast to a lot of the other cultures, they're not presented in um, uh, at least not overtly, a kind of religious text. They're not like descriptions of how to navigate the afterlife. There are some examples we have that are actually official documents, like a government official filed this report about so and so who had an NDE in this village on this date. It was witnessed by these people, and here's the outcome. So it was very much like possibly the first overt documentary type NDEs that we have. And the earliest is pretty interesting because it involves a man who has an NDE, and while he's in the other world, he meets the Emperor of Heaven, he calls him, and at the Emperor's side, he sees a little boy. And then when he comes back to life, decades later, they're not really clear about when it happens, but it's some years later, and he's walking down the street, and he sees a man blocking his path, and the guy won't get out of his way, and he starts to recognize him, and they kind of make eye contact, and he says, what's going on? Where do I know you from? And the little boy proceeds to describe the man's near-death experience, or the man, sorry, I gave it away. The man proceeds to describe the other man's near-death experience, and it turns out that he was that little boy standing at the side of the emperor, and that he happened to be having a near-death experience at the same time as this other guy. So that was a validation of near-death experiences, and basically that these experiences really happen, and that proved to the Chinese authorities that these were actual genuine experiences.
Interesting. We
Yeah.
got a live stream comment. I love Greg. He's so well researched. I'm currently getting my doctorate in psychology, and I make let's see, Greg's research to my professors. Oh, they make a point to point out your research to their classmates and professors, and they said thank you.
Oh, thanks. Nice.
Thank you, the real deal. Let's see here. Where else was I going to go with that? So yeah, I find that interesting that the ancient China. That's one culture I don't know a ton about from super antiquity, so I would like to look into maybe that a little bit more as well. Do you think that there's similarities in these afterlife beliefs across cultures? Do they, suggest a shared human experience of death, or could it be evidence of some sort of cultural diffusion? What do you think about that?
Yeah, again, as I kind of outlined earlier, I think the cultural diffusion argument can be dismissed, at least in this case, with these 5 ancient world areas. And yeah, as far as the similarities go, the conclusion I reached basically was that there was this set of similarities that were kind of you know each set was found, or this set was found in each of these civilizations. It was almost like they were transported in the set, and that was these main elements of the NDE, which were leaving the body, entering darkness, the deceased relatives, the being of light, et cetera, et cetera. They were practically universal. I think there were a couple of cases where 1 or 2 might have been missing in one of the societies. For example, like the panoramic life review that we're familiar with from NDEs. That's a little iffy. They all have some kind of review of what your life was like, but this like panoramic thing seemed to be pretty much missing in most cases. So yeah, and again, I think because of that consistent set of similarities, I think that shows that the NDE had to have preceded what was going on in all these cultures. That's the only way that I can think of to explain them, other than like some nebulous, amorphous idea of like, oh, the human brain constructs myths in similar ways. To me, that's not really an explanation, because we don't construct creation myths similar ways, and we don't have, there's no like correspondence of each myth to each culture. These are elements within afterlife myths that are occurring in these sets.
So based on your research, obviously, there's nobody knows the answer to this, but do you think that do you think there is a metaphysical reality beyond this life? Do you think that these ancient religions were suggesting it, or like what do you think's happening here? And then also give me your personal take on it after.
Yeah, they were presenting this as knowledge. It wasn't like, here's an idea of what, we're speculating philosophically to these ancient civilizations. And I guess to religious people in general, this is knowledge. This is like something that me personally, I don't understand belief, and I don't have that knowledge. So so I kind of I haven't decided one way or another. I don't really. To me, I either know something or I don't, I guess is the easiest way to put it. And because I don't have direct knowledge of this this phenomena, maybe if I had an NDE, I would feel like I had that knowledge. I know people who do have them talk about them in those terms. A lot of people who have them are no longer, they don't doubt at all that there's an afterlife or that they survived the death of their body. I haven't had that experience. So for me, it's just like speculation. And I'm really not sure which, what's going to happen. To me, there is some of the evidence to me is pretty compelling. Like for example, the ancient Chinese one I mentioned that recalls these accounts in modern times where people they'll have an NDE and go to the other world, and they'll meet their Uncle Bill or whatever. And they'll think, well, Uncle Bill's alive. And then they come back to life, they come back to their body, and they're told, well, we're glad you came back, but by the way, Uncle Bill died yesterday. That kind of thing is like inexplicable to me unless there's something really going on with this person soul leaving their body and going to another realm. But then again, people could say the super psi hypothesis or whatever.
I mean,
or it's anecdotal.
Can we just be real here from like a teleological standpoint? Like, this is weird, right? Like, what's the point
It's
of
weird.
all,
Yeah.
right? Like, why are we here? Like, this is, even if this was some sort of cosmic accident, you could make the argument that on the most base level, like almost like a Richard Dawkins argument of like our genes just want to replicate, or we just want to survive like everything else that's living or whatever. But from the standpoint that we do have these faculties, this consciousness that allows us to appraise the world around us in a way that other things don't, that's the thing that always gives me pause. And you could say, well, we're so much more evolved, or we evolved with these faculties or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just, like I said, it's just, this is too weird, right? Like the fact that we're even having this conversation right now, like this whole thing's just super bizarre, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I do think though that it's very conceptually feasible that there could be an afterlife that's atheistic. I don't think there has to be a God in an afterlife. So like, there could be a Dawkins type model that
what if you get to choose? Like, what do the atheists, if they get there and they're, oh, there is an afterlife, what do you think they choose? Think, oh no, I'm going home, I'm going nowhere, I'm nothing anymore, like what do, because I don't know. I again, it's just one of those it's just so bizarre to, I've thought about this again, I've had my own near-death experience. Well, let me just point out, you can go back, anybody listening, and listen. I did a 2 or 3 part thing on my near-death experience. My heart did not stop, but I did lose consciousness for a while and lost so much blood that I needed a blood transfusion. So I needed medical intervention. Now, I saw a white light. I felt like a warmth, but both my wife and my mom were there saying things, and I was like in and out, and it just seemed maybe I didn't cross that threshold. They always talk about when you listen to these people that had these real, like, vivid near-death experiences, it seems like most of them are people that have their heart stopped or they're had cardiac arrest, right? I don't know if I'm sure you're familiar with that aspect of this phenomena, but anything related to the heart, whether it's a heart attack or heart stops, whatever, those are the people that generally have the most vivid, most intense near-death experiences.
Mm. Yeah, and there's also some evidence that seems the longer somebody's dead, then the deeper experience they have. So people who are only dead for a couple of minutes might leave their body and see their body and see a light, and then wham, but they're back in the body. Or if somebody who's dead for 20 minutes or an hour, they might go further and meet their relatives and see these supernatural landscapes and whatever else. And actually, that's something else I should mention, which also relates to your comment about how weird it all is, and that's how different NDEs are. Not only between cultures, but even between individuals. Even Raymond Moody in 1975 in the first modern book about NDEs pointed that out. He had this list of 15 elements or whatever, and he said, but not one account that he's found has all 15 of them.
Check
And so
that out
even,
too, people listening. It's called Life After Life. I highly recommend. If you're interested in this topic, that's probably where you should start.
yeah, that's where it
Or
started.
maybe
And in a
start
lot of
with
ways,
your work, but then obviously more modern stuff. That's like the beginning of the more modern
yeah,
look at.
and in a lot of ways, it hasn't been superseded. A lot of NDE books are repeating the same stuff that's been repeated for 50 years. So, which is not to disparage them, because everyone has their own take on them. Um, but yeah, anyway, yeah. Sorry, go on.
So, who do you think out of all the ancient civilizations you've studied had the most data or knowledge on the topic? I'm going to guess the Egyptians, but that's just a guess.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I guess they were the most focused on it, but I don't know if they were as experientially focused as, say, India was, for example. I think it's impossible to tell because we don't have the texts um, that overtly talk about experience. It's again kind of speculative, but they were ritually super focused on death and the afterlife. Almost obsessively so. There's lots of also ritual stuff in the Rig Veda and other civilizations. Um, China was probably a little less ritually focused, at least in the texts, and same with Mesoamerica. So I think it just kind of, I think that's an impossible question to answer. Yeah, because there's lots of experiential stuff in the ancient Chinese texts. There's quite a bit in Mesoamerica. So I think it's all kind of parsing the degrees to which they're interested in life after death philosophically and metaphysically, or experientially or ritually. But everybody's interested in it.
Do you think now with AI we'll be able to go back and kind of maybe use that as a tool to go parse some of these ancient texts and symbols and things out, try and figure out, um, maybe a little bit more definitively what's going on? Or do you think that that's more still, since we're designing the AI, that'll be flawed in that way? I know it's kind of a chicken and egg thing.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's more that, to be honest. I think AIs may be good in yeah, helping to analyze things that already exist, and maybe well, things like reading scrolls that have been charred and are rolled up, and archaeologists can't undo them. To kind of use to scan them and then feed them through AI to try to get different kinds of data and information. It's not a technology that I know that much about, other than seeing how bad it is. When I use like Chat GPT for some research question, or ask it a question about myself, it gives out just tons and tons of wrong information. Um, the videos that people make of, like, you see on social media, where there's like a gorilla cuddling a kitten or whatever, these weird things, to
Oh
me they look
yeah,
really creepy.
yeah.
They're instantly recognizable as AI. The music it puts out it's uh it's got a vibe to it that I just don't click with. So, and I think it's the uncanny valley, that thing where if something looks a little bit too human or too much replicates something that a human does, it gives us the creeps. I don't think AI has come out of that yet, and I don't know if it ever will.
Interesting. In terms of, would you ever consider going back further than you have? Like, I know at Göbekli Tepe they just have like symbols and stuff on their T pillars and things like that. But would you ever consider trying to find evidence in older sites like that? Maybe that transitional period of hunter gatherer into Mesopotamia or something along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, that would be great, but the texts that I talk about in this book are the world's earliest discussions of an afterlife period. Like there are no earlier texts in each of these areas. Um, so, I mean, obviously the Egyptian texts are earlier than the Aztec texts or whatever, but as far as that area is concerned, it's the first text that originated in
What
that
about the
culture.
Indus Valley? Because I know that they haven't really translated everything from there yet.
Yeah, I don't think they have any substantial text though. They don't have any, body of work, a corpus. So, and see, that's the problem with archaeology. There's a great article written, I think, in the '60s by Peter Ucko, which is still totally relevant, and I think, or at least I hope, it's still taught in undergraduate archaeology classes. But basically, he explains the dangers of trying to extrapolate from archaeological sites and especially burial sites beliefs in an afterlife. So um, for example, there was a lot of speculation that if the corpse position was facing west, then that meant they were facing the land of the dead. If they were buried with their sword, that meant that they would be equipped with their sword in the afterlife in spirit form. The spirit of their sword would go with them. Or if they had offerings of food, that means they would be able to eat in the afterlife. But Peter Ucko found these ethnographic analogies, they're called, basically similar types of burials in anthropological and indigenous societies through anthropology that had completely different meanings. So, for example, a sword was broken and buried in order to destroy the power of that sword. It had nothing to do with the burial. And gifts were thrown in the grave, not to go accompany the other world, but as like the people after having finished their feast, dropping it as like the final tribute. So so I don't think it's possible to like understand any prehistoric, pretextual societies' beliefs just based on their archaeological remains. So we could speculate all we want, but there's
No,
not
no,
really
that
any.
makes total sense. I mean, without um, that library or that corpus of knowledge, it would be kind of, you'd, again, like you just said, you'd be kind of making assumptions, grasping at straws, which is kind of what, earlier what we were discussing with all the pseudo and alternative stuff and everything. That's what a lot of that stuff is just taking like one point, kind of running with it.
Yeah.
But and I found it funny when we were doing that part of the conversation. We got a thumbs down. It's like I don't really see too many thumbs downs. I mean, I'm sure we've gotten them, but it just
But I'd be
again,
curious to know why. Because
people
I often
want
feel like,
they want the mystery. They want they want the mystique. They want the, like I said, they there's a whole bunch of people that want to believe in something right now, and I think that
sure,
saying civilization's older than it, they're telling us, or we've got all the dates wrong, we got all the knowledge wrong, or what. It's just romantic, because it's
yeah,
like, oh, we got to figure this out. There could be something special here.
yeah,
And they fail to realize we are special. That,
yeah,
like I said,
and
the fact we're having this conversation is amazing and nuts and crazy, and we are dust from stars, basically. Like, there are things to us that are magic that people overlook, looking for this, the pyramids being 10,000 years old as opposed to 4,500 years old or whatever.
yeah, yeah. There's plenty of mystery out there without going down, without creating false mysteries out of things that don't exist. Um, yeah, and I think unless somebody is willing to engage with archaeology on its own level and on its own terms, nobody's ever going to be convinced of of any pseudo-archaeological claim. And you mentioned earlier that, people spend their whole lives researching these topics, and then somebody comes along after watching a video. But it's not even just person that's spend their lives doing it. Egyptology has been a discipline for a couple of hundred years, since Napoleon or whatever. And this has been, so not just one person spending his or her life researching this stuff. It's standing on the shoulders of giants. Once again, it's this accumulation of knowledge which is constantly being improved upon. Texts are being retranslated all the time. There's what, 3 or 4 editions of the pyramid text, for example, which is a totally obscure text, let alone how many there are of the Book of the Dead. So knowledge within these disciplines is constantly being reevaluated and rewritten.
Let me ask you a question too, and this is just like a dream of mine. This is something I considered early on in the podcast. What if archaeologists compiled lists of mysteries or things that are mysteries within their field, so we know what the real mysteries are based on the people that are actually doing the digging? That way, if somebody does want to really investigate something, or maybe they can help in that way. I always thought that there could be like a there could be a team up, or obviously somebody that hasn't gone to school for archaeology is not going to be able to go dig in the dirt and, like you said, get permits and do all the thing. But maybe they can look. Maybe they're an expert in linguistics, or maybe they're an expert at deciphering texts, or maybe they can help in some way. So I always thought, like, instead of being like, oh, that's not a mystery or that's not a mystery, we know that. What are the real mysteries? What are the things we can't agree on? Like, what are these gray area topics that we can then look to and be like, these are the real mysteries. Let's figure these out first.
I don't think there are any massive secret type life-changing history change or civilization.
I don't even mean that. I mean like things like, where's Genghis Khan buried, or where's whoever, Cleopatra, like whatever these things, like where are these things like that are maybe not, like you said, like finding the Ark of the Covenant so we can all connect to the aliens or whatever, what I'm saying, like something that's a little bit more legitimate.
I think it's part of what makes people go down these romanticized archaeology paths is because a lot of it is actually boring. So the answer to that is probably just that there's more stuff to be discovered, and there's more stuff to be interpreted and restored and cataloged. I would go, when I went on excavations, you excavate tons and tons of shards of pottery, and then you put it in different piles depending on whether it's a rim or a base or a handle or a central piece. And once you count them up, and some of them go in a certain pile, some go in another pile, most of it you throw back into a pit and rebury. So it really feels like this futile exercise, but it's all about information gathering, and largely for the next people who are going to be on the site. And eventually these things will kind of combine to form some foundation for knowledge or theorizing. So I can't even think of like some like great archaeological mystery that still needs to be solved. It's more of a question of like, how can we better understand what's out there? And that's really the goal and the point of the whole discipline.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure obviously we know that there's other mounds similar to Göbekli Tepe in that area that just have not been excavated yet. So we know there's we know there's other sites and stuff like that.
I was going to say, and I was just in Belize, and I was at a site called Caracol, which took maybe 4 hours to really explore. And then after we explored it, the archaeologist guide who was there said, "You've just seen 1% of this site. So the rest of it is still covered by the jungle canopy, basically." So if 1% of that site takes 4 hours to see, imagine how vast, how massive that site is going to be. But, it's going to take forever. None of us are going to be around by the time that is finished being excavated.
Well, I mean, that was a major, LIDAR was a major, I mean, if you look at what LIDAR's done for archaeology in the Amazon, it's insane.
Yeah, it is. And that's how they're able to tell, what percentage is left unexcavated. And so then the question is like, why should they excavate it? What is the point? Is it only for tourists? Are they really going to learn more of what they need to know by doing so? And again, it's limited resources. to be able to put into this. The government doesn't, Belizean government doesn't have a lot of money to put into archaeology. So it's got to come from universities and private funding. So a lot of obstacles really in the field.
Interesting. So where do you go from here? What's next? Is there something you're looking into? What are your takeaways? Was this a passion project and now this is kind of the culmination? Like what's going on here?
No, after this ancient civilization book, I wrote a book on near-death experience in indigenous religions, and that's been out for a few years with Oxford University Press. I'm now working on and so both of those were comparative projects. The ancient civilizations one was a kind of wide, grand comparison with these 5 civilizations. The indigenous religions one was looking more at we have a lot of accounts of near-death experiences from these traditions. I'm talking about like Native Americans and Africa and the Pacific, small-scale tribal societies. So we actually have accounts of near-death experiences, and they talk about how they influence their beliefs and how they base their beliefs on them. So it kind of zeroed in a little bit more from the Ancient Civilizations book. And now I'm doing one on near-death experience in classical antiquity, so looking at Greece and Rome. And again, we have quite a few examples of NDEs from these.
I was going to say that one's going to be interesting too. You have the Lucidian mysteries. You have
exactly
the Pythagoreans with the transmigration of the soul. You have a lot of different things happening there in ancient Greece.
Yeah, and everybody knows about the myth of which is people say it's the earliest near-death experience, which I don't think it was. But not everybody knows about Pythagoras' near-death experience or his intermission memories that he had between personalities when he was reborn from one personality to another. He also remembered the interlife state. So I'm kind of bringing all this stuff together and talking largely about how these experiences influenced afterlife beliefs, but also the diversity of attitudes towards them. So they were ridiculed by some people, they were believed by some people, and others just kind of were trying to understand what the hell's going on, like we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, Pythagoras, aside from the number magic stuff, seemed to be influenced heavily by either Vedic or Eastern philosophy, kind of. It seems to be compared to traditional Greeks, and that whole thing.
Yeah, you read that a lot, and that's one of the things. I was just working on that today, actually. Everybody who writes about where did Pythagoras get his ideas about reincarnation, they always look for a pre-existing model. So they think, okay, maybe this other philosopher was talking about it. Maybe he got it from shamans on the Black Sea, or maybe he got it from India or some other culture that believes in reincarnation. Nobody looks back and thinks, well, people who have reincarnation memories, that's an actual phenomenon that happens cross-culturally. He claimed to have had this experience. He claimed to have remembered this state between lives and all this other stuff. So why couldn't he have gotten the idea of reincarnation from his own experiences?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you next. Is we don't know how much of Pythagoras's writings were attributed to him specifically, or his cult members. I think that's what because if anybody's listening, I do a series called Masters of Rhetoric, where it's kind of like basic philosophy course / going into all of Plato's dialogues, breaking them down, the sophists and all that kind of stuff. And we did touch on Pythagoras because we talked about the pre-Socratics and everything. And to your point, I didn't actually know that he had his own intermissions or past life. Obviously we things we talked about, like the ascetic cult and being a vegetarian and transmigration of the soul and things like that. But yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, within classical studies, things like that, and even the myth of were kind of seen as an embarrassment. Like classicists are pretty staid type people. They don't like all this paranormal stuff, and they don't want to see the Greeks as being irrational and woo woo. The Greeks are the philosophers, are the foundations of Western civilization, but they're actually tons of metaphysical thinking and supernatural stuff, and magic.
Well, I mean, even Plato had this idea, the theory of forms. There's this other realm where everything in our realm is based off of these more perfect objects in this other realm. Like if that's
Yeah.
not metaphysical, I don't know what is.
When you look at some of the classical scholarship about the myth of Ur, they literally say this is a shock to come to at the end of the Republic because it's an embarrassment, and how can we take this seriously? It's like they're trying to sell. It reminded me of creationists trying to still be Christians in light of the existence of dinosaurs. It's
I
like
mean,
they're
I think
completely
the
shocked.
Republic's probably one of the greatest pieces of writing of all time, but that's just me. And you
Yeah,
could
and the fact
you
that
make the
he ends
argument
it.
like we get our soul from Plato and we get our logic from Aristotle, right? Because when Plato would drive a point home, he would use mathematics or logic, and then you get Aristotle, and he's looking at biology and these biological factors contributing to the answers for things. So yeah, kind of a
Right.
mix of it's kind of a mix of what we are, right?
Yeah, and it's because of that rationality that ending the Republic with a near-death experience upsets so many classicists. It's like, how can he be rational and still be, recounting a near-death experience as something that really happened?
Awesome. Well,
Yeah,
let's wrap it up here. I'd love to have you back on. Like I said, there's a ton of stuff that we probably could have discussed, but I really wanted to focus mostly on the near death stuff, obviously, because that's what your book's about and the topic and everything. And again, everybody go check out Gregory's book. I have the link down below at the bottom. I have his website if you're interested in all of his links. And then I have the intertradition links to his book, as well as the Amazon links if you purchase your books off Amazon. Is there an audio version too? Do you have an Audible yet for that?
not yet. I think there will be, but I don't
You
think
should
they've
do
done
it.
that. So yeah, yeah,
You
it's
should
up to
read
the
it too.
public.
I like that. I'm a fan of. I mean, I read a lot of books, but I also like listening to books
Yeah,
too, like while I do stuff. So
yeah, I volunteered to read it, so hopefully they'll take me up on it.
cool. Sounds
Yeah,
good. We'll check
great.
that out. As I mentioned before, we were on a hiatus for a few months. I'll do a solo episode coming up where I go over everything. Let's former co-host Maurice got married, so congratulations to Maurice, and we'll have him back on soon to discuss some stuff. He had some weird experience he wants to talk about. Let's see here. Oh, I did move a bunch of older episodes to our Patreon just to keep things clean and division of what the show used to be, what it is now. I think people get confused sometimes if you listen to episode 1 versus episode 323. There's been a long path and everything. And so, yeah, some of those older episodes are on our Patreon now for $2 a month. You'll also get exclusive content, which, there's a good chance if we've had a big guest on the past, there's probably some exclusive content on there as well. You can check out our documentary, As Within, So Without, From UFOs to DMT, which is, again, looking at these different phenomena through the lens of the mind. Check out Masters of Rhetoric, my other series, which is available on YouTube, Spotify, and all podcast outlets. Episode number 5, I will be firing up soon. I don't know how soon, but I'm going to try and start, working on that. I do want to break down Plato's dialogues and the dialogue specifically with the sophists, so look for that. And if you just want to support Mindscape in general, just click on the Linktree link down below, and we appreciate all your support. But listen, Greg, this was a fantastic conversation. I learned a lot. And like I said, I'd love to have you back on again sometime in the future, even if you don't have a new book coming out, just to have a conversation.
Sure, anytime. Thanks.
All right. Well, there you have it, folks. Again, check out Greg's books. Links down below. Support Mind Escape. Click the link tree. And I'll see you everybody soon. We love you. Stay safe out there. And everybody have a good night.